Welcome to this podcast. In this podcast, I'm going to talk about when Venus dances with Pluto. So Venus and Pluto are two functional lights, very important ones. They represent signs that are really opposites of each other. Well, opposite not in the sense of conflictual, but opposite in the sense of evolutionary objective or evolutionary destination. For Venus rules Taurus and Pluto rules Scorpio, and Taurus and Scorpio sit opposite each other on the zodiac, on the natal chart. And in some sense, they are same because you see, they both talk about something that is very key in the development of the human personality. Venus starts the narrative around the sense of pleasure. And these circuits are very early circuits that are laid down. They're actually laid down already. They're just programmed to match the reality system that the child has been born into. And this is something that starts very early in your head. It's how you really begin the narrative in your head about who you are and what is going on as your reality. And it's a very simple type of awareness, which is why the newly born child would have it. In contrast, Scorpio is something that is much higher in its evolution because Venus is the seed of that Pluto. But now the story is being told after some type of evolutionary steps, but the story is being told within the context of another person. Okay? So it is the nature of a reality system where you can identify with another. And so that means that there must be a self that can go into the reality system of another. Hence the evolution from Taurus to Libra before getting into Scorpio. Now, when Venus and Pluto come together in the natal chart, they're talking about this process. The process of how this sense of pleasure, this very fundamental sense of pleasure, how it really becomes Scorpio. Now, it's not an easy narrative, and I'm talking about all the aspects, generally speaking. I mean, the conjunction would be the more potent aspect, but it depends on what you're really trying to understand, because the conjunction is a kind of replacement in some sense, where two things come together and they disappear. And now what you have is a hybrid of sorts. Okay? An opposition is not a conflict. An opposition is more likened to a seesaw, more like what Libra is doing in terms of trying to balance things out, but also try to represent things. So both functional lights, the narrative within the natal chart, they look for that balance. And that now becomes an important story that the person is telling. The square is the most dynamic of these aspects. Why? Because it induces a rotation. It is not natural in the sense that things continue in their line of being, or they continue in their state of being until they are intruded upon by a force. So objects might continue in the same direction until something comes and bumps them in another direction. But that's what the square is. The square is a bump. Okay? So it always indicates a set of events or a time period where something will be bumped. Either the Venus will be bumped by Pluto or the Pluto will be bumped by Venus. Well, the consideration will lead to a change in direction. That's why it's a square. Now, the change in direction is not unusual. It's not really a change in direction. It's part of the life story, but the individual doesn't know. And that's the entire point of the process. Because these two aspects that represent the square, they are aspects of one thing. It's just one person. So the person is being made aware of these two aspects of themselves and why these two aspects are important. How they are part of one thing. And so the life story, that period of time and all that, it's meant to bring such people clarity in those areas so that once they can accept what the structure is, what it has always been, then they have a source of dynamism in them. That's what the square is. It's initially difficult, but once you can sit it, meaning once you can accept it and find true comfort in it, it now becomes something that is very powerful, especially in the ability to interact with realities. Okay? And Venus, Pluto, most of it is always coming from the fact that Venus is compensating. It's compensating because it's always part of some type of narrative that has to do with the definition of self-value. And more often than not, narratives start from this because it's so fundamental. And the narratives that sit in Taurus or in Venus, they are very fundamental enough to become, they're like the background narratives. Why? Because whatever motives are originated in Mars or in Aries, their first physical form is in Taurus. Okay, so it's an identification and a recognition process, but it's also a process of connecting the sense of self to a physical body. So you have a deep relationship with your body there, with your material senses, because these are the ways that you inform of the world. Now, sometimes the sense of self-value, there are many narratives tied around it. One of the narratives could be impairment. And the person struggles with this impaired sense of self-value. And as they grow older, they learn to compensate for it. They learn to replace that sense with something else that they have constructed. And then they are plagued by the fact that this thing, it's a construction, it's not real. And so they go even into further compensation. It's all a design. The idea is that while they are doing all of that, because it's uncomfortable, they will be looking for ways to make that thing real. And that now becomes the essence of the story. Because they're going to make choices in those areas. Okay? Within those choices will contain what they really think about themselves in terms of their self-value. Okay? The natural tendency in the very first, because like I said, since human beings are born ignorant, basically, it means that you're allowed to make some mistakes. It is by design. The first set of choices that are made in these scenarios where Venus and Pluto are sitting in some way, they usually revolve around fear. And fear overclouds the sense of self-value, whatever that is. It overrides it, forcing the sense of value to point towards compensation. Now, because the seeds are sown in fear, and these are decisions that you would not, under normal circumstances, not attach to your sense of self-value, because that's not what you really want. You're just imagining that that's what you want because you imagine that it leads you to something else. Well, it doesn't. Because when you're looking at that thing, you know that that's not what you want. So you are aware on some level that you are compromising. But you are afraid to not compromise. And therein forms the basis of what is going to become the transformation. Because the transformation requires that you get into problems and then you are delivered from those problems. The entire point is for you to become aware of, or more aware of, this aspect of you that has to do with how you value yourself. That's really what it is. Okay? So the more common theme of this type of thing is that you find yourself in relationship with people that you should not be in, because of your truth. You find yourself trying to make it work. What do you mean make it work? Okay? And then you go into compensation mode. It's one of the things that we can do because we have free will. We start telling different types of stories in contexts that are not real just to be able to justify, something, and then put that thing within that context and say, oh, it's all good. But it's not. Why? Because when your sense of self-value sits very well, honestly, within you, you begin to experience output of that in other areas of your life. And one of it is in this area you share with people so intimately, whether you want to call it sex or other things that you do that bind people together. That area improves. Why? Because you are making better decisions in that area. Because you can see your self-value clearly, or as clearly as you want to. So the idea is that the choices that we always make with reference to others, they are a reflection of what we really think of ourselves. Do you understand? And we don't value ourselves based on money because we don't know what money is. We learn about money as actual people living in a social reality. By the time we begin to understand that money is a singular narrative or is a symbol that is now used to represent self-value, most of us have already made a lot of decisions in those areas already. There are very few people who can actually associate self-value with money initially. That means that their vectors are pointing towards something because it's an attenuation. The sense of pleasure that Venus really is much more complex than money. Money is very symbolic. It's almost one-dimensional. So it draws out a specific type of behavior out of an entire range of behaviors that human beings are capable of. Okay? So it's very simplistic. And the human sense of self-value, even though it is very simplistic in its dichotomy, it can be a very complex thing because it will underwrite all the complexities of human behavior. It's something that we form when we are very little, but it's something that we use to now pattern the world. And you're making decisions according to those things. You are choosing. Okay, so in some sense, whether you are going into the third, the fourth, all the way to the 12th house, it's the second house that is forming that platform. on how you are actually standing those choices, because those choices, they are carrying what you really think of yourself. When Venus starts its dance with Pluto in the natal chart, then it means that the sense of self-value has suffered some impairment, and then the impairment itself is part of a narrative that is spooked in some sense, because it's connected to the core. And the core, which is Pluto, is a very scary thing initially because you don't know what it is. Most children don't understand what sex is, especially the way that adults behave about it. They intuit gradually by themselves that it must be something very, very bad or something very, very troubling. It creates apprehension even in those whom they learn, to trust reality from. You understand? So these two things, at some point in time, they sit, or during the development of the person, they sit in an uncomfortable state. And at some point in time, when it becomes necessary to start telling stories of self-value, what a person owns, either as a child or in school or whatever it is, people begin to experience problems there. And one of the earliest problems is that they do not know how to share. It doesn't mean that they cannot be generous. They can be generous because they are responding to other parts of their nature. But when it comes to truly sharing of themselves, they find it very difficult because, first of all, you have to have a self to share. And that self to be shared, it is constructed by self-value. Self-value originates from the sense of taste. That's where it starts. That's why I say it's a property that starts in infants. And if you have more pleasurable experiences, genuinely pleasurable experiences, your sense of self-value tends to grow. I'm not talking about experiences where you're compensating. I'm talking about genuinely you desire something and you find the manifestation of that desire. Well, it leads to good places. If you struggle there, manifesting, you desire something, you like it, you may not even have the courage to like it openly. You may not even have the courage to acknowledge that you like it to yourself. These narratives, they are interfered with at many, many levels. But because the sense of value or sense of self-value is such a fundamental pathway, right? These things show up much higher up in the trees later on. Okay? The tree of your personality growth. Now, those areas where they show up, those are the places that need to have the transformation. And simply what that means is that the stories that have been patterned in that area, they have been patterned at a very primitive level because you're not supposed to change them. You can't even if you tried. And you're not supposed to have early access to them. So you don't know what they are. But they're very powerful stories. Why? Because they're sexual. And so as you get older and experience life, you will experience moments where that part of yourself will be transformed, which is the normal terminology used in these things. But what it really is a revelation. You will learn something about the way that you value and assess yourself. And as a result of that, the areas of your life connected to that very process, they will begin to alter. And the altering is very material. You see it as either the kind of people that you interact with in terms of the people you eventually become intimate with. That is the people that you learn, that you allow to learn your secrets in some sense, right? And you will also see it in the area of money sometimes. Why? Because money comes from association. And if the association is acceptance, then money flows to you. Okay? Usually the way that the transformations are brought about, they are the results of some types of extremism. The extremism is in the area of value, so that either a person is choosing something that is extremely bad for them because they do not realize that it is extremely bad for them. But that statement itself becomes an assessment of their self-value. Do you understand? Or they're choosing something that is extremely good for them. That also becomes an assessment of their self-value. And both will lead to ways of adjusting the psyche. Because the thing about narratives tied to Venus and Pluto is that the assessment of value, once it sits eventually, it will satisfy something that is very, 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 very fundamental because it's written in the language of Scorpio. You understand? And that's always about power. It's about influence. So these are some of the pathways that Venus and Pluto can take in a natal chart. Of course, the stories are fiendishly complex. Why? Because, you have so many types of aspects and each one is saying something, This Venus-Pluto dance can be in any of the distributed lights, any of the signs. Those will also impart their flavors. So it's a very complex thing to put together, but also very simple. That's why we can teach it. Okay? But, And in the natal chart, it's always very important and beautiful to see this complex interplay that can sit between, because ultimately, even if it's in a square, you still have to sit it. Why? Because it's only one person. So at some point in time, you're going to have to recognize that both sides of you are just you. And you have to begin to understand why you want to hold them separately. Why negate one aspect? Okay? And this is what we do in the Prometheus program, is to bring the focus of these things into view. Okay? It's a facilitated program, so it is not done directly. Now, for those who have already encountered transformative events, Venus, Pluto, it always revolves around Scorpionic themes like money, denial, rejection, betrayal is one of the worst ones. All right. And the reason is because you are dealing with the core, and the core is very, very powerful. Very, very, very powerful. So the emotions it stirs, they're also very powerful. Okay. So once the narratives of self-value are patterned after these things, you know that there is going to be, or there are going to be one or two persons in your life who will come into your life with life-changing consequences attached. You will choose those persons. And then you will understand why you chose them eventually. Okay. So they are very important things. If you have them in your natal chart and you want to understand how they are part of a much larger narrative, a much broader story, then come acquire your natal chart synthesis. Go to my website, fill in your details, make the payment, and you'll receive an email from me a few minutes later.